Hey there. So nice to meet you. I realize we just met and we don't really know each other. But before we go out for the first time, I'm going to insist that you sign this contract that will cement us right into a long-term exclusive relationship with each other. If we turn out not to have good chemistry, or if you just plain decide you don't like me, that's too bad. You're stuck with me. Oh yeah, and I also intend to get deep into your pockets to pay myself quite handsomely under the terms of our relationship contract. Sound reasonable? Of course not. This is big-time relationship level jumping.
Yes, it is level jumping.
Stay tuned to learn why this is happening in the real estate market right now and how you can protect yourself against it. Hi everyone, I'm Matt DeFanis, broker owner of RE/MAX Realty Associates with offices in Champaign, Mahomet, and Monticello, Illinois. You may have heard that the real estate industry has recently undergone some practice changes. As a result of a class action settlement involving the National Association of Realtors, members nationwide faced a legal mandate to implement certain practice changes. These changes were intended to enhance transparency for the benefit of consumers. Before I cover the changes, I want to explain briefly how the industry had operated prior to the changes. When a home seller listed a home for sale with a realtor, most of the time those listings included a total brokerage fee that included not only the compensation for the listing agent who marketed the property, but also compensation for the agent who brought the buyer. While MLS listings in modern history were not required to include buyer-agent compensation, nearly all of them did. The result was that buyer agents were almost always being paid from the seller's side of the transaction, but the amount of their compensation was not usually readily apparent to their buyer clients until closing. And even at closing, the compensation may not have been parsed out to make clear how much went to the buyer's agent as opposed to just a total brokerage fee owed by the seller. Some buyer agents would misleadingly market their services as being free, since the buyer was not writing a separate check to pay their agent. This was misleading because the agent wasn't treating this as a charitable endeavor. Rather, the agent was getting paid, and the buyer's purchase price was ultimately where the money was coming from. This was one area that lacked transparency. The other area lacking transparency was the amount of compensation being paid to the buyer brokers. Prior to the recent changes, the compensation offered to buyer agents could vary from listing to listing, but without buyers necessarily being able to see those amounts in the MLS. When you combine the lack of transparency with the fact that an assortment of similar properties might come with significantly varying compensation amounts, there was concern that unscrupulous buyer agents might steer clients in the direction of the better paychecks. So with that as background, here are the two big changes. Number one, buyers must now sign some sort of written agreement prior to doing showings. And number two, the multiple listing service, aka the MLS, can no longer serve as a vehicle for communicating offers of buyer broker compensation. Now keep in mind, offers of cooperating compensation are still permitted. You just can't communicate them via the MLS. These practice changes went into effect in most U.S. markets on or around August 17th of 2024. Many states already required written buyer representation agreements under their respective real estate license statutes. Illinois, where I practice, was not one of them. Prior to the settlement agreement, written buyer representation agreements were not required here. A license law update set to take effect on January 1st of 2025 will soon codify the requirement of written buyer agreements into our License Act here in Illinois. While the requirements of these written agreements was intended to ensure that buyers were protected, I've seen evidence on social media that some practitioners have exploited the written agreement requirements to the detriment of buyers. I made this video in the hopes of educating home buyers so they are better able to guard against the exploitative practices. As I mentioned at the top, I'm a practitioner here in Illinois, so this will specifically reflect practice in Illinois, although many other states are similar. There's a broad range of types of buyer representation agreements, and the two key variables across this spectrum are exclusivity and duration. Regardless of those two, all buyer representation agreements must specify the amount of the buyer agent's compensation. At one end of the spectrum, there are non-exclusive buyer representation agreements. These will satisfy the basic legal requirement for getting a buyer in the door to see a home without locking the buyer into working only with that one agent. This type of agreement, especially with an initial short term that may be from a few days to a month, would be appropriate at the beginning of a working relationship with an agent. The Illinois Realtors Trade Organization has colloquially referred to this type of agreement as the gateway agreement. That is, it's a logical starting point, such that if things go well in that relationship between the agent and the client, this creates a gateway to a subsequent exclusive agreement. I believe buyers generally derive the greatest benefit from selecting a single agent who can thoroughly understand their needs and provide exclusive expert representation. But it's perfectly reasonable for a consumer to want to interview or audition more than one agent before making a decision on whom to work with. A non-exclusive agreement gives consumers the flexibility to continue doing showings with other agents, at least at this early stage. A consumer could even ask to limit the agreement to just one specific property that consumer has asked to see. So using my own business as an example, I pay to advertise and to attract buyer showing requests on various consumer websites, including Zillow and Realtor.com. When a member of my team responds to a stranger whom they've never met, I believe it's important that we don't try to yoke that stranger to us exclusively on a first meeting. Even a new client who is referred by a mutual acquaintance would reasonably expect not to be locked in to an exclusive agreement from the very first meeting. Yet I've seen numerous competitors post on social media photos of an exclusive right to acquire agreement that was in their stack of paperwork for a first meeting with a new prospective client. That type of agreement is exclusive to that agent and it guarantees no matter what you buy or how you buy it, you're going to owe that buyer brokerage compensation under that agreement. Consumers should rightly be terrified of this type of agreement being presented on a first meeting. Most buyers will find it advantageous to retain the services of a buyer broker who will exclusively and expertly represent their interests along every step of the transaction. A good broker can save time, save money, and potentially help their client snag a home the client just flat out wouldn't have gotten without their assistance. Not surprisingly, those good agents need to make a living providing this expert service, so compensation and loyalty are certainly important. But don't let an agent pressure you into signing an inappropriately restrictive representation agreement at your first meeting, claiming that this is what's required of all brokers. Yes, we need a written agreement prior to doing showings, but there's a whole range of options. Make sure you choose the right option for you and your circumstances. If you have questions, ask. These practice changes are supposed to protect consumers, but you need to be equipped with enough knowledge to make sure they do. As always, feel free to reach out to any of my team members or me with questions, and feel free to leave feedback in the comments.